Hello! Mass Effect holds a special place in my heart. I basically played them as they were coming out, and the universe they crafted and the characters they made have stuck with me for a long time. Rex, Garrus, and the 12th party member from Mass Effect 2 are some of my favorite characters of all time, and the way that the plot threads of the series weave in and out over the course of these games is truly spectacular. That being said, recently, I realized I hadn't thought about these games in a while, and I hadn't seen them discussed in a while too, which I thought was kind of weird for a modern game series like Mass Effect. So I did a quick double check and realized these games came out 12 years ago. Time makes fools of us all, I guess. This revelation, coupled with the fact that a friend of mine had never experienced these games and knew basically nothing about them, led me to replay the series with a fresh set of eyes. And man, these games are truly fascinating. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to see how these games both shaped the gaming landscape and were shaped by it, and it left me with way more thoughts than I expected. So, given that the dust has settled and the games are easier to play than ever, I think it's worth giving them a retrospective, and potentially trying to get new people to check the series out. Because, even today, this game series is worth checking out. It still holds up, so let's talk about why. Before we begin, I should note that there will be no significant plot spoilers in this retrospective. All plot discussions will use examples from the beginning of these games. That said, if it appeared in promotional material or happened in the first few hours, it's fair game. So I will be discussing things like the premise of the third game and many of the squad mates in these games. So, with all that said, let's start at the beginning. What is this thing? Part 1. What is this thing? To broadly summarize these games as much as possible, this series is a hybrid of shooter and RPG, with more focus on the RPG than that combination normally conveys. You spend a lot of time in these games just talking to people, and are frequently presented with opportunities to dig into the world building of the setting. Conversations happen for their own sake, and not just as delivery methods for gameplay, and much of your time in the game is spent talking and learning about squad mates. The other half of the game is combat. These games are mission-based, where each mission pits you against a variety of enemies that you need to work with your squad members to overcome. You tend to have a large selection of allies in these games, and each has a unique set of abilities that can complement yours. Ability cooldowns are not shared between you and your squad mates, allowing them to support you frequently and cover your weaknesses. If you choose to play a soldier, a gun-focused class that is primarily a damage dealer, you can bring squad mates that provide crowd control and debuffs to turn the tide of combat. This makes the game more squad-focused than many other shooters, as your choice of companions can affect things significantly. These two modes play off each other. In video games, you don't want the player to be doing the same thing for too long, as anything can get repetitive if done without a break. These modes work well at playing off each other to alleviate boredom. While dialogue seeds can be long, more often than not they are broken up by combat sections. Combat sections also don't overstay their welcome, frequently taking small breaks to include dialogue and exposition. You're never stuck doing one mode for long enough that it gets repetitive. This is the bread and butter of the game series. A combination of interesting storytelling and combat enhances both sides of the experience into something memorable. This means that the quality and fun factor of these games depends a lot on how good or bad these elements are. However, before we really get into it, we need to address an elephant in the room. Part 2. Mass Effect 1 is a weird game. Note that I did not say bad game. Mass Effect 1 stands. Give me a moment, okay? Mass Effect 2 and 3 are very solidly shooters. The gunplay is punchy and impactful, and many of the RPG elements serve to enhance the shooting significantly, and the game keeps a laser-tight focus on the gunplay and dialogue to make them as polished as possible. Mass Effect 1 is not that. Mass Effect 1 is an RPG with gunplay as the main form of combat, and you can see how it was influenced more strongly by games like Baldur's Gate 2 than it was by Call of Duty 4. The biggest example of that is that Mass Effect 1 has a whole third leg of its gameplay beyond talking and shooting, that being exploration. Many of the planets are places that you can land on and drive around in the Mako, making the universe feel more open and explorable than any other game in the series. There are collectibles dotted around almost every world that you can find, both big and small, and a few interesting hidden surprises. The game also subtly tries to get you to do some exploration without making it simply feel like another side quest. If they had simply given you a quest marker and said, "Okay champ, go visit X number of worlds," it would have felt forced and similar to the game's other content. Instead, the game is peppered with a variety of unrelated side quests that involve traveling to a location and doing a thing. For example, you hear reports of a Geth stronghold somewhere in the Armstrong Nebula. Going to investigate requires you to examine the worlds in these systems and land on a few, at which point you discover several curious markers on your map. You examine those and, hey, would you look at that, a mysterious set of ID tags that you can find if you explore other worlds. Now you have a motivation to go out and explore what was organically discovered instead of being forced upon you. This is also supported by the length of the game. If you simply follow the critical mission path, this game is the shortest of the trilogy and it's not close. Even if you stop to do many of the major side quests, it can still feel short compared to the other games in the series. This isn't an accident, however, because the game sets aside a large portion of gameplay for exploration. You're not supposed to just rush the main critical path. The game wants you to spend time exploring the cosmos, seeing the sights, learning about the world and the stories it has to tell. Unfortunately, this spread of content comes with drawbacks, and the largest result of that is a lack of polish. If you've heard anything about the Mako, it's not the most amazing thing to drive around. Floaty doesn't accurately describe it. Tiny bumps will launch you, you'll get stuck on the oddest things, and generally journeying anywhere can feel like a hassle. I also found the controls to be consistently confusing, although that could very much just be a me thing. However, none of these are the biggest problem with the Mako. That would be the combat. The weapons provided aren't bad by any stretch of the imagination, they're perfectly serviceable. What they are is boring. You hold left click. Sometimes you press right click. You drive in very sloppy circles. Then you go to bed because you are so eepy.
The missile is very tired. He is eepy. Nini time. Good night, Mr. the Missile.
This is exacerbated by the fact that damage tends to be easy to mitigate. Mako enemies are divided into two groups, ones that die almost instantly and colossal enemies. The ones that die almost instantly can still deal meaningful damage to you, but as previously stated, they die very fast, so they aren't the main threat. The main threat are these big guys, who can deal significant damage and take a long time to kill. However, they can be dodged with cover or just circle strafing, and as soon as you bump into one, you discover the secret tech. Are you ready? I bet you aren't.
Three more of these outposts left to clear out? This should be fun.
Thrilling gameplay! I'm gonna come out and say it, these sections are boring as hell. They aren't a meaningful test of your skills or a combination of anything you've built up to, they are pointless time wasters to make the game feel bigger than it is. And if all the plot mandatory missions dropped the Mako, I would personally not miss it at all. In its role as a tool for exploration, it fits much better. It adds an actual challenge to traversal instead of just pressing the forward button. That being said, I don't know how well the exploration by itself will hold up to discerning exploration enjoyers, as open world design has shifted drastically in that time, and in my opinion, for the better. Mass Effect 1 was originally released in 2007, 1 year after Oblivion, and it feels very much of its time. Worlds mostly consist of open plains with occasional interesting vistas or level geometry, with collectibles to find and occasional dungeons to clear. These dungeons are generally constructed from copy-pasted assets that can feel somewhat samey. Fortunately, exploration isn't the only leg this game has to stand on, and it's here where I can start getting back into positives. This game's combat is a lot better than people give it credit for, and I think a lot of it comes down to expectations. While this game does have cover, and it does have shooting, this game is an RPG first and foremost, so the shooting tends to feel a bit low impact sometimes. That's because you're not meant to just sit behind cover popping shots, you're meant to use abilities to supplement your gameplay style. Let's take a moment to examine a fight in close detail. This is actually one of my favorite fights in the game, and it's a fight that takes place outside a mine. My squad is pinned down behind these boxes, and peeking my head out of cover tends to get me quite aggressively shot at. So what do? I start using my squad's abilities. These leaping enemies are hard to hit, but my CC abilities can lock them down for long enough for me to finish them off. I'm taking too much damage from enemy fire, so I use debuffing abilities to buy me time to take care of enemies. Mass Effect 1 is much more about the flow of battles than it is about the nuts and bolts of shooting, and it rewards you for leaning into that. You need to make your own openings, and doing so makes them much more rewarding than simply waiting for them to happen. The Legendary Edition brings these qualities into even sharper focus. The original Mass Effect 1 was much more punishing of weakness, and if you bring a class that didn't specialize in a weapon, you could barely wield it at all. In the Legendary Edition, every class can wield every weapon with decent proficiency, meaning you can realistically play in almost any way you want with any class. It's a really nice benefit of this version. That isn't to say the combat is perfect. Allies can take a little bit to use abilities, which can be frustrating, and the game has a large number of combat encounters that don't serve to test anything other than your ability to stay awake. This is an RPG, and RPGs tend to have some amount of filler combat, but using your abilities to destroy your enemies is still fun even when it's not that much of a challenge. Also, I couldn't figure out where to put this, but the equipment system in this game just sucks ass. They do the RPG thing where the main reward for exploration is a bunch of new armor and weapons, but in many cases the guns feel identical, and you get so much loot so frequently that it becomes a chore to take care of. Like, look at this, oh my god. This is the only part of the game I would call unequivocally bad, but it fortunately gets axed in future games, so you don't have to deal with it for too long. The context for the gameplay also helps enhance it. I think it's possible to divide quests into 4-ish tiers. First is the main quests, your heavy hitters. These are quests you need to see to complete the game, and as a result, they tend to have the most time and budget put into them. Next are almost main story quests. These quests are, yes, optional, but the game really wants to try and get you to do them. These tend to have production values close to, if not rivaling, the main story quests, and the game tries very hard to get you to do them. Mass Effect 2 actually presents a great example of this. Your squad mates will give side quests that have to do with their personal arcs, and doing these side quests make them loyal and gives you a bunch of benefits. While they are technically optional, you are heavily incentivized to do them, and there really isn't a reason not to. Third, we have proper side quests. These are quests that are generally lower in scale and scope than the previous two kinds of quests, but have some kind of hook or interesting plot bit to keep them interesting. An example from Mass Effect 1, this man, Samesh Bhatia, has lost his wife in war, but the military has been keeping her body for reasons he does not know. Upon investigation, you discover that she was killed by unknown advanced weapons, and the military hopes to examine her body to figure out good countermeasures against these kinds of weapons. You have several options for how to deal with this quest, including convincing the military to surrender the body, convincing Samesh that it's best that his wife's body stays with the military, and, importantly, failing to convince either and leaving everyone unhappy. While this quest does only have 3 steps, it has interesting narrative weight behind it, and multiple options for its conclusion, which makes it interesting and worth doing. Finally, we have filler quests. These are the worst of the lot. These are quests like, you need to scan 5 terminals, or you need to clear out this base of enemies because they're bad. They tend to be short, quickly completed in 5 to 10 minutes, but they can also be long, game-spanning collectathons. The important, uniting quality of them is that no one cares. The characters don't seem to care beyond a certain amount of lip service, the devs didn't seem to care very much because it has no more depth than a sheet of paper, and you, the player, probably don't care either. Out of the entire trilogy, Mass Effect 1 has the highest density of proper side quests. You can definitely feel the fact that they're generally low budget, but the writers have put a surprising amount of work into making sure that most side quests aren't just filler. They tend to have at least some sort of interesting narrative hook, tend to have a few methods of resolution, and tend to reward you if you bother to pay attention to dialogue. Speaking of dialogue, I think it's worth comparing it to how other RPGs do it. Dialogue in many games, like Baldur's Gate, takes the form of a long list of possible responses, mixed between asking for more details and advancing the story. On the one hand, this is amazing for role-playing, as it allows you to be able to select exactly the kind of response you want your character to have in any given situation. However, it can also get very overwhelming. For a new player, especially a new player unfamiliar with RPGs, the dialogue needs to be crafted extremely carefully to not be off-putting or confusing. There also tends to be a problem with having difficulty expressing what you specifically want. I talk about this more in my Baldur's Gate video, but basically, it's really difficult to have an RPG that is actually able to account for everything the player wants to say. Mass Effect avoids all these pitfalls via streamlining. For one, Shepard is a character. You can control what they say to a certain extent, but they do have their own personality and concrete backstory, which helps alleviate the feeling that you aren't able to say what you want. It's not the game having a lack of options, it's just that Shepard, the character, won't be willing to take that approach. Beyond that, the dialogue wheel also helps prevent things from feeling intimidating. Only immediately important dialogue options are presented to the player, and many of the optional world-building questions get packed away into the investigate option. This helps distinguish between the two, and it means that players who don't care about the lore don't have to keep being bombarded by options, while still letting the player get into the nitty-gritty of the lore if that's what they really enjoy. This streamlining is what makes the system both approachable to new players and familiar to veterans of the genre. All these points together is the reason I described Mass Effect 1 as more of an RPG than the rest of the series. It has ability-focused combat that is significantly distinct from other first-person shooters, its side quests reward paying more attention and tend to allow for greater player expression, and its exploration is more developed and integral than the rest of the series. My recommendation when going through this game is just to pick out the parts that you like and focus on those. If a side quest seems interesting, do it. If not, don't worry about it. If exploration seems fun, go exploring. But if it feels tedious, then just ignore it. Even if nothing about the game is clicking, you can just beeline the main story and get the game finished in a very short amount of time. Mass Effect 1 is very permissive in letting you figure out what you want to do with it. I also want to take a minute to talk about the story. I want to try and avoid story spoilers as much as possible, but the basic hook of the story is that the main character, Shepard, gains accidental access to long-lost secrets of a long-dead civilization, and the story revolves around uncovering what happened to them, why, and how to stop it from happening again. The story itself is decently well written, but its greatest strength is the character writing. A part of the story that gets more and more important as the games continue is the idea of unification, of mending old wounds and moving forward, and those themes would not hit nearly as hard if you didn't have characters you cared about struggling with those themes as well. The game also benefits from being a trilogy that carries all of your decisions forward. By the end of the story, the progress you've made feels earned, because in large part it has been, and there are very real narrative failure conditions if you cannot achieve your goals. That's as far as I'm willing to go into the story in this video. There are narrative breakdowns all over YouTube you can watch if you're still unsure, but I don't want to spoil anything if I can help it. So, after Mass Effect 1, the developers took time to examine what it was that people enjoyed about their game. They found people really enjoyed the story, were satisfied with the combat, and found the exploration to be mid. Then they got to work on Mass Effect 2, and in so doing, developed Part 3, the Mass Effect formula. Mass Effect 2 is, in my opinion, one of the best examples of a sequel done right. That is not a statement as to the quality of the game, we will get into that shortly, but instead to point out that they did an insanely good job of understanding what people generally liked about Mass Effect 1 and improving on that. The story and world building were widely praised, so the main story was expanded, giving much more room to grow. You now have a much longer set of both main quests and almost main quests, each of which is designed to showcase the world and the characters from a more naturalistic angle than the first game's direct exposition. Companions were a highlight of the first game, so each companion has more scenes dedicated to them, and their own personal loyalty quest, which expands upon their character significantly. The setting was also expanded, allowing players to interact with the darker side of the setting, instead of just through the frame of Alliance work. These changes are in service of making these games much more focused than the original. Exploration still does exist, but it's significantly toned down. You mostly just spend some time scanning planets for resources, and occasionally you will stumble on secret lore or occasionally a tiny mission. You can also stumble on very small side quests in some hub areas like the Citadel, but these are generally very small and don't matter much. They tend to be very simple on dialogue or world building checks that are nice, but not that interesting. Shout out to this Krogan though.
Oh, blue rose of Ilium, let your roots dig deep into the hot soil of Tuchanka. Let our scorching sun and sheeting rain turn your supple beauty into strength. For if our love is to survive, it must grow thorns to pierce the hand of any that would uproot it.
The effort that once went into the previous game's side quests has instead been focused on companion missions. In ME1, companion missions were very short and also not available to everyone. A companion will turn to you and say, "There's a very bad man out there and I want to kill him." So you will go to a random planet, enter the copy-pasted base, kill the bad guy, and your companion will say, "Thank you, Commander. I feel a lot better now that the bad man is dead." That's not the case here. In Mass Effect 2, each companion has a much more detailed, much more compelling personal mission that takes you through a unique combat mission. What was once interesting but missable good side quests have become elevated to be almost main story quests, with dedicated bespoke missions to go along with them. This change of focus means that, while exploration feels thinner, companions feel much more developed. It's easier to find their hidden depths, and you actually have a reason to play around with them. These quests are also much more telegraphed. Multiple characters give you alerts about their existence, and if you just regularly talk to the people in your ship, you're bound to find them. They're not hidden. This is what I mean about Mass Effect 2 being more focused. Mass Effect 1 is a game about exploration. The quest to stop Saren's plan is definitely important, but side quests take up such a large portion of the experience that they end up feeling even more significant than just the main story quests. Shepard is a space explorer and peacekeeper, and ME1 is about her doing her job. ME2, by contrast, tells a specific, focused narrative. There is a clear narrative tension and escalation. Characters follow arcs and perform meaningful actions that directly affect the narrative. Basically everything Shepard does is in service of her main goal, and there is extremely little sidetracking to be distracted by. That specific, focused narrative and cast of fleshed out characters ends up being Mass Effect's greatest strength, so I think this was a very positive decision. However, the biggest change is to the combat. Combat has been polished to a mirror shine. Guns are now snappy and feel much higher impact, and the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad loot system has been axed completely. Instead, each weapon type has a small selection of meaningfully different combat options, allowing for a player to choose different playstyles for each weapon, instead of just stats. Classes have also been made significant across the board. Each class has access to different sets of weapons, but because of the shortening of cooldown times and the general increase in ability damage, playing a caster character that does not rely on guns is not only possible, but fun. Guns also used to work on a heat system, but have been rebalanced to use clips instead. Enemies have also been rebalanced to be more interesting to deal with. In addition to more enemy variety, enemy defenses now mean something. If enemies have shields, armor, or barriers, they cannot be crowd controlled, which makes them significantly more threatening. You can just shoot through these protections, but certain abilities are effective against these defenses, incentivizing the aggressive use of abilities to clear them. Speaking of which, companions also got an overhaul. Abilities in this game put all abilities of that character on cooldown. So if Shepard were to use, say, pull, then all of Shepard's abilities would go on cooldown until the pull cooldown was finished. However, each person in your squad has their own separate cooldown timer. This vastly increases the importance of companions, because companions can cover your ability weaknesses in both cooldown and effect. If you deal good armor damage, bring companions with overload who can disable shields, companions with raw damage to help deal with chaff, or CC to lock down unprotected enemies. Your squad mates matter a lot, and because cooldowns are much shorter, you can feel their impact much more frequently. This leads to a combat system that is dynamic, interesting, and cooperative, especially on higher difficulties. The higher the difficulty, the more enemies have protection and the more deadly they are, so you need to manage and mitigate their regression effectively to survive. There can definitely be more than one frustrating game over, but for 90% of the experience, I had a blast. However, there is one large flaw with the combat system, and it's a flaw that happened a lot in cover-based 2010s shooters. Cover is very strong in these games. Obviously, it blocks 100% of incoming damage, so staying in cover basically always keeps you safe, while getting out of cover tends to leave you open for damage. This means that, generally, the optimal strategy becomes parking yourself behind convenient cover, poking your head out to shoot until your shields break, then going back into cover until your shields are back, rinse and repeat. This is a play pattern I like to call pop and shoot, and it has some effects on combat. One, it's very powerful. As stated, cover blocks all damage, so as long as enemies don't advance on you too quickly, which they generally don't, you can repeat that play pattern indefinitely and not die. The devs do try to counter this to a certain extent, including specific enemies that can throw grenades, run at you, or damage you behind cover in one way or another, but that serves more to get you to change cover than it does get you to change strategy. This strategy is also boring! Not all the time, fortunately. At its best, it requires managing multiple threats at once, juggling multiple sources of pressure while slowly losing resources. However, at times it tends to get fairly repetitive, and at worst it makes fights feel so samey. This was a style of combat that was very popular around the time of ME2 and ME3's release, that being 2010 to 2012. This is the era of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1 and 2, the first Black Ops game, Battlefield 3, and of course, Medal of Honor Warfighter. Oh man, do you remember this game existed? Anyway, this was a very popular model for gameplay in the early 2010s, so it's not surprising that ME2 is emulating its peers to a certain extent. But given how long it takes for shields to regenerate, it's still rough. However, I'm going to give you a secret. a secret that will make your Mass Effect gameplay significantly more dynamic. Are you ready? Vanguard, baby! Vanguard Charge is a staggeringly broken ability. With one button press, you can instantly refill your shields, slow time for a moment, and get into close range to obliterate an enemy with your shotgun. And, importantly, this ability is on a very short cooldown, which only gets shorter as the game goes on. Shotguns are also a very solid weapon type, as are short-range SMG fire, meaning playing aggressively lets you clean up fights faster than just pinging at enemies behind cover. This means that you are rewarded heavily for not staying behind cover. You don't need to play defensively. Instead, you can play up close and personal, and once you get some cooldown reduction under your belt, you can just stay completely out of cover, relying on charge to keep you alive. Especially if you implement the age-old secret technique, strafing. That being said, to my great disappointment, you cannot just Vanguard Charge your way to victory. Especially in the early game and on harder difficulties, the damage will just be too high, and the charge cooldown will be too long. Fortunately, in situations like this, you still have the option to utilize cover, and it comes with all the benefits that the strategy normally provides. Plus, because it's not the only strategy, your gameplay ends up far more varied, which means that in the moments that pop and shoot is required, it feels like you're actually utilizing your kit to deal with the challenges in front of you, instead of just using the one strategy. But let's say you don't actually like gun-ho supercharging into the mix. That's fine. The game has a wide selection of classes to choose from. Take Infiltrator. Infiltrator's tactical cloak allows you to spend time lining up headshots, making your pop and shoot far more powerful, but also allows you to play aggressively, using SMG sprays to take down even relatively tanky enemies. This allows for very tactical gameplay, using the right tool for the right situation to take down your targets. Or take Sentinel. A versatile suite of abilities, along with an amazing tanking ability, allow the Sentinel to juggernaut, poking out of cover for longer and even advancing aggressively on enemies. Or, if you like cover combat, you can play an engineer, who can summon drones and defensive stripping effects to set enemies up for kills from a distance. Mass Effect's blend of RPG and real-time action works really well here, allowing for the player to customize their experience significantly, and helps these games be extremely replayable. This ends up being Mass Effect's second major strength. There are many video games with good stories but somewhat boring gameplay, and a large portion of the rest are turn-based games, a genre that does not suit everyone. However, Mass Effect combines a compelling and detailed story with engaging and fun gameplay, which is a part of the reason I think it struck a chord with people. Both sides of the equation help to bolster the other to make something truly special. Part 4. The Discourse Zone. Mass Effect 3 was released in 2012 in the same way that a Molotov is released into a street fight. I remember the amount of fighting there was about this game. It was insane. There were, and to some degree still are, a lot of very angry people who will tell you that this is the worst game in the series and lit the entire trilogy on fire, etc, etc. I never really thought that was the case, even back then, and in the wake of other train wrecks, I definitely wouldn't put Mass Effect 3 even close to that caliber of disaster. However, I can see why people were upset. Mass Effect 3 had a troubled development, and it still definitely bears those scars. The game can sometimes be buggy, and you can feel a lot of pressure to be like other games that came out around that time. Who doesn't love turret sections? Time, however, has been very kind to Mass Effect 3. For one, the Legendary Edition gave them the time they needed to clean up the more serious bugs. The game still has its bugs, don't get me wrong, but in general it feels less duct-taped together. Mass Effect 3's DLC also provides a lot of enhancement to the experience. In particular, a lot of world-building elements that were only gestured at in the base game get heavily expanded on, in ways that give them a lot more weight and gravity than they did in the original. The DLCs that don't do that are also very fun, particularly the Citadel DLC. That DLC is probably some of the best content in the entire series, and it's all bundled together with the Legendary Edition for no extra charge. This means that new players are going to have a much better, more fleshed out experience than players had back in 2012. This, to be fair, is true for all these games. For example, the Mass Effect 1 facelift is pretty massive, and ME2's DLCs are pretty good. But I think ME3 is the game that benefits from time the most of the trilogy, because it's had time to rectify a lot of the early flaws. With that in mind, how good is the game? Pretty good. ME3 is not as dramatic an overhaul as ME2 was, but it did take the time to consider what could be improved on moving into the sequel. A lot of the more significant changes are there more because it's the finale of the story than because ME2 did something wrong. For instance, almost every companion in this game is a returning character who has been built up through the trilogy. As such, the need for companion missions fleshing them out is less necessary, so that effort was instead redirected to quests that focus on returning characters from the previous games who did not end up as squad mates in this one. The character building of squad mates is instead conveyed in smaller, non-combat sections, which are generally very fun to experience. They also let squad mates talk to each other a lot more, which is very nice, and allow the cast to feel a lot more like friends than they did in the previous games. This game also reached a satisfying middle ground for the game series' long battle with morality systems. Mass Effect was one of the most popular games with a binary moral choice system, which was used to unlock special dialogue options at various points. However, the series struggled with the best way to implement these systems. In Mass Effect 1, persuasion was a stat you could put points into, like guns or abilities. The max of the stat was capped by your Paragon or Renegade stat. In Mass Effect 2, you simply gain access to these special choices by simply picking enough Paragon or Renegade dialogue options. This streamlined the system heavily, but ended up punishing players heavily if they decided to not go fully one way or the other. Finally, in Mass Effect 3, both stats contribute to a reputation meter, which is used for both kinds of checks. This means that as long as you're picking Paragon or Renegade options and doing side quests, you can gain access to all special dialogue options. Combat also has some improvements. Some of them are mechanical. For example, you can now cleanly move between different pieces of cover instead of needing to exit and re-enter cover every time. Defensive protections are also used more sparingly, especially on harder difficulties, allowing CC to flourish once again. This game also significantly expands on the idea of ability combos, something that did show up in Mass Effect 2 but was not really focused on. Now, many abilities prime enemies with elements, which can be detonated for massive AoE damage. It's a system that incentivizes smart usage of abilities while also being very fun to use. However, the most major change is the overhaul of the weapon system. Instead of each class getting a set number of weapons, any class can equip any kind of weapon. However, each weapon has an associated weight, and the more heavy weapons you carry, the slower your cooldowns become. This adds another axis of customization in addition to your basic class. Now you can favor playstyles that use heavy weapons and limited abilities, or a more ability-focused approach with limited weapons. Weapons can also be customized with a variety of mods that add even more flexibility. The word of the day when it comes to ME3's combat is options. In ME2, there was a very limited supply of new weapons, maybe 3 to 4 for each weapon category. In ME3, that number has been increased to around a dozen for each weapon category, and each weapon feels distinct and has a reasonable niche to fill. Classes have a wider range of abilities to select from, and each ability now has multiple branching choices, instead of the singular that was available in the last game. Companions have also been fleshed out with new abilities, giving even more depth to each companion that existed in ME2. While the core is the same, these changes add significantly to the formula. That being said, not every change was a positive one, and I think it's worth delving into why. I mentioned turret sections earlier, and I want to bring that back up. Has there ever been a good turret section in any game, honestly, that was good and fun? It's basically a glorified loading screen and a time waster. But it was a very popular trend in shooters at the time, so here is Mass Effect trying to copy it. Dialogue has also been stripped down. Neutral options are gone in most instances, leaving your only choices as Paragon or Renegade, and there are generally fewer opportunities to investigate than in previous games. This is generally in service of making a more streamlined, compact narrative, but does cut down on some of the role-playing decisions the player can make. The dialogue feels a lot more like a linear road with occasional deviations than an opportunity for role-playing. Granted, this decision was likely not made just to appeal for popular trends. Mass Effect 3 has a lot of loose threads to clean up from the previous games, so making the game a bit more linear and cutting down on some dialogue options gives the writers more time to iron out possible variations of other scenes. I can respect that on some level, but it unfortunately does diminish the moment-to-moment feel of a lot of dialogue scenes. That being said, the game is still good, and I'm surprised how many little callbacks there are placed around. As much as some people want to argue that it is, Mass Effect 3 does not feel like a cash grab to me. There has been too much care poured into a lot of little things. Companion dialogue especially is generally gold across the board, and I'm surprised by the number of optional dialogues you get if you bring specific companions. That kind of detail helps elevate this game above the schlock it could have been. And that's really my thesis on the whole series. More than just the sum of its parts. It would have been very possible for Mass Effect to be a fairly average shooter experience, just as it would have been possible for Mass Effect to be a cult classic RPG that never really broke into the mainstream. However, by combining approachable gameplay with simplified RPG mechanics, it creates a very special kind of RPG that can be enjoyable for a wide range of people. If you want a good story, but find yourself getting frustrated by turn-based combat and limitless options, Mass Effect provides you with approachable gameplay and a narrative that lets you express your opinions without needing to get bogged down in a lot of nitty-gritty world building. If you're a fan of more complex RPGs, Mass Effect has an extremely fleshed out world that lets you dive deep and interesting build crafting options to play around with. Mass Effect is a wonderful example of an easier, hybrid RPG that brings the best out of all the genres it's combining, and I think it's worth playing even in the modern day. Thank you.